Anyway, let me start by saying that we need Roosevelt now. We need what he stood for, how he led the country, how he went to save the United States in a terrible crisis and to save it from the Nazis who were in New York and London and Germany. And the ones in New York and London were the ones who put the Nazis in power in Germany. And this is all in the period when Franklin Roosevelt was president. We need him, and I'm going to discuss how he changed himself in a certain period of his life and put himself into the mental and moral position to provide the leadership necessary to save the country and to prevent the world from going to hell. And obviously the first question somebody would have is, well, why do we need Roosevelt? He's a controversial figure. All of our history is controversial. I think that by showing you how he changed himself in this period, you will have also a good sense of why we need that kind of a person and how we could bring about changes, political changes, philosophical changes quickly in the population to make there be born now Roosevelts. Not just born as babies and grow up, but people who are now kids or young adults or older people to act like Roosevelt. What's needed to produce a new Roosevelt or a whole generation of people that think that way? I don't know if this is going to show up. I think the computer's frozen. What do you think?
Let's see.
There you go. Oh, there we go. Okay. Well, I can't use that mouse. That's the problem. Too much. Okay, here we go. That's not too bad. Can you show this on a whole screen? Let's see. There. Oh no, that's not. Back. Okay, I'm just leaving. This is fine. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So this is the home of Franklin Roosevelt in Hyde Park, New York. And I took this picture when I was there this week, when I was walking on a path, taking a break from research, going down towards the Hudson. This is looking up at the house. At that complex with his house is the Presidential Library and Museum that has the archives of Franklin Roosevelt. It has his personal letters, it has his political letters, his writings, the White House files. He set that up himself so that the public would have access to all these things in 1940 while he was president. That was the first presidential library. That sort of forced the other presidents later to do it, even though they weren't as good. Kennedy did a similar thing with his stuff in Massachusetts. So I spent 4 days there, and in preparation for that, I did a lot of study of the problem that seemed to present itself to me. There were two problems. One of them is that there are many different versions of what Franklin Roosevelt is politically that people believe. Some people say he's one thing, some people say he's another thing. And of course, as usual, the people who say these things often have never studied the matter and don't know what they're talking about. But that doesn't stop the opinions. Is he a Jeffersonian? Is he a Hamiltonian? Is he a fascist? Is he a communist? Is he an aristocrat? Is he a banker? Is he a Democrat? Is he a Republican? Is he stooging for the Japanese? What is he? And then the next question was, I had heard that there had been a change in his point of view. from earlier in his career to later. And by my study, I found out that this change more or less took place from the time he got polio in 1921 and was fighting to recover from being crippled from the waist down until 7 years later, 1928, he ran for governor of New York, was elected, served for 4 years in that office, and then was elected president. By the time he ran for governor, he was fully equipped and ready, and had already begun to reorganize the National Democratic Party. So, having some idea of this to start with, I wanted to find out what was the change. So I went up there, and I spent 4 intensive days of study in FDR's own letters, his materials. The staff is very friendly. They're very excited about anybody doing serious research. And this is crucial because, in general, the 20th century and the 21st century does not usually involve very serious investigations of history. Most history is simply received from one person to another. You know, like we were talking about his father had the idea that no one makes up a new idea. They always get something from the past. Well, that's what history is usually. So we had to do something entirely different here. When he was in politics, he started out in the legislature in New York, born in 1882. He's in the legislature in the early 20th century. And he was appointed by Woodrow Wilson in 1913 to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He had studied the Navy, knew a lot about it. In that earlier part of his life, up until his late 30s, he was somewhat stiff. He was very pleasant and so forth, but he had I have found quite a different outlook. He always wanted to help the people, and he knew a lot about the background. His family background goes back to Isaac Roosevelt, who was that's his great-great-grandfather, who was the right-hand man to Alexander Hamilton in the Revolution, in the New York State fight for the Constitution, things like that. So he's a patriot and wants to help people, but not the fighter for taking on the gods of Olympus, for taking on the powers on behalf of the people. He didn't really have that to begin with. And he told Frances Perkins, when he was president, she was the Secretary of Labor that he appointed, he said, "I was a mean cuss when I first came into politics." He didn't particularly like people. He was just doing things as a so-called reformer. Let me see if this works. When he was he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He's the tall fellow. This is when he could walk. And the shorter guy is the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels. And, you know, I would encourage people to take a note or two so that you could look things up, rather than say, well, this guy said so-and-so, I'm not sure about it, and go on to another subject, because this is all new. And you're going to have to think about this yourself so that you can help bring this about. All right, so this is the Secretary of the Navy in World War I, and he tried to stop the war. He was anti-imperialist. He didn't want the U.S. to go into that war on the side of Britain.
Tell me, what was his name again?
Daniels, D-A-N-I-E-L-S, and he had a biblical first name, Josephus, J-O-S-E-P-H-U-S. And he taught FDR a lot. FDR called him chief because he worked for him at that time. And later on, he made him, when FDR was president, he made this guy ambassador to Mexico because he was an anti-imperialist. But that's not the only influence at that time. Here is Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin Roosevelt with Admiral William Sims, S-I-M-S. That's Admiral Sims. And he was the head honcho in the group of pro-British American military officers, particularly naval officers. So he was really happy to be in World War I on the side of the British. How did he get to be like that? He was the naval aide to Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, from the Oyster Bay, Long Island Roosevelt family. They're tied together a long time ago. They're fifth cousins, FDR and Franklin. But Theodore Roosevelt was Franklin's, in many ways, his hero when he was growing up. And he married Theodore Roosevelt's niece, Eleanor Roosevelt. So she was already a Roosevelt when he married her. And Theodore Roosevelt gave Eleanor away in marriage, his niece, to Franklin Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt's policy was that there should be an Anglo-Saxon world empire.
Oh,
He took office by the assassination of McKinley, and he was a racist, and he was a man who shut down the West, reversed many of Lincoln's policies, pretended that he was helping the working man by stopping Rockefeller or something like that. But he actually didn't do that. He didn't stop any of Wall Street and turned over the country to them. But because he was so robust and an activist and got the government to do things, maybe not the right things, but to do things, FDR thought very highly of him, and they were fairly closely connected. So after he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, in 1920, at the end of the Woodrow Wilson administration. Here, you go ahead. That's all right. Sure. Franklin Roosevelt was nominated by the Democratic Party, young man. He was nominated at the age of 38, I think it was, to be the candidate for Vice President of the United States, along with a guy named Cox, who was running for president on the Democratic ticket. They were defeated in that election. But Franklin Roosevelt made a name for himself around the country. He was a handsome young man. He used to run up the stairs everywhere and so forth. And so that summer, after the next summer, rather, the election's November 1920, the next summer, Franklin Roosevelt got polio. You all know what that is? It used to cripple the children and kill them. And he apparently caught it at a Boy Scout camp. He was head of the Boy Scouts in the New York region. And so for a while, they thought he would die. And he was paralyzed. Most of his body was paralyzed, and then he got a little bit better. While he was recovering and fighting to recover the use of his legs or to be able to walk in any way with crutches or canes, that was a fight just to do that. While he was doing this recovery, he decided, with the help of Eleanor Roosevelt and his aide Louis Howe, H-O-W-E, that he was not going to quit politics, that he wasn't going to quit. In fact, he was going to use this somehow to come back and do greater things. Like challenging the gods, right? Like saying, I'm human, I'm going to use all the powers that are in me as a human being. And that's right, and I've got creativity too. So this was his tremendous fight. So one of the things that I saw in the archives there was the records, different kinds of records of the massive book collection that he put together. He already had a lot of books. He owned, when he died, he owned 22,000 books personally. And they're all in this library. This is one of the index cards that he wrote out down here at the bottom. You see this? This is one of the first edition of an Edgar Allan Poe story that was published in 1839. He bought it for 50 cents. He was a very good bargainer, and he bought all kinds of books about American history. He plunged into American history. He got the Federalist Papers, the papers written by Alexander Hamilton, primarily, and Madison, that showed why we have to fight for the Constitution. He devoured every word of that. He aligned his constitutional thinking to that. And he really plunged into the history of the American Revolution, and not reading what some guy says about it. You know, sometimes when I make a discovery or someone else make a discovery in history, somebody will come up and say, "Where do you get your information?" As if they're asking, who told you to say these things? They don't understand anything about how you make a discovery using primary sources, and how you put together a story to show what's going on, to understand it for the first time, what's going on. That's what he was doing about American history. He did, later when he was president, he said, I know something about economics, even though I went to Harvard. He didn't get a good education at Harvard. They don't teach you. They're not truth seekers. He had a, I'll show you the next one here. Oops. I wonder if it is. I don't have it here. I'm going to go back. Hold on. I don't see the front page of this, but this is a book about the death of Alexander Hamilton. It's a 1904 account of Hamilton's murder by Aaron Burr in a duel, but it was a setup to kill Hamilton. And in that book, there are the letters back and forth between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, where he's challenging him to a duel. And the intermediary, the guy who actually organized the duel, is this guy, William P. Van Ness. You see his name up there at the bottom? He signed that letter. He organized the duel. When Burr hid out after Hamilton was killed, Van Ness was a fugitive, and he was arrested. And his young partner, named Martin Van Buren, got him out of prosecution. Later on, when Aaron Burr committed treason, went to Britain, came back, he made Martin Van Buren his partner, and they brought in Andrew Jackson to try to bring down the powers of the United States government, because they hated the United States. They thought in terms of the international oligarchy. This is a book, among others, that FDR is reading. He has 4 editions of Fenimore Cooper's History of the Navy of the United States, 4 different editions of it. He himself thinks in many ways like James Fenimore Cooper, who was a naval strategist as well as a novelist. He has 2 editions of The Pioneers, about the settlement of New York. He has the Franklin autobiography, an original edition. He also has a book of Franklin's works translated into French. And Franklin Roosevelt was, among all US presidents, the one who spoke French the best. Fluent French, and also very good English, very good German.
Who did?
Where I got that from is that Einstein met with him in the White House in 1933, and he reported, the president speaks very good German. So another book that he has is called The Expulsion of the Jesuits from France. I think, I'm not sure how many volumes it is, but it's a detailed account of why and how the Jesuits were kicked out of France when the French decided that they were spies for the English and for the oligarchy, instead of acting as Christians. All right, so let's look at what FDR did here. Now, he's reading these books, he's thinking, he's studying. He wrote in 1925 an article called Alexander Hamilton. And in this article, he tells about Hamilton as the most important founder of the constitutional system of the United States. This is in the papers of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's never been published. To me, that's, I would say, beyond negligence. It indicates the absolute ignorance of the academic authorities in this country, as well as the intentions of the people that control those universities. So he starts off talking about Hamilton as a boy who's brilliant, who comes up from the West Indies. He sees slavery down there. This is not for him, this system. He gets up to the United States. He joins the revolution. He's a valiant soldier, noticed by, and leader of men in the revolution, noticed by Washington. And then he has a great record in the revolution. And then the country calls on him. This is the way Franklin Roosevelt puts it about Hamilton. You need to know this. You need to understand this. If you want to understand the Constitution, this is the way Franklin Roosevelt saw it. Is that an authority? I think it is. I think he knew something. What we're trying to find out here is, what did he know that Americans don't know today? Okay? So, when the country was in danger of falling apart without a plan for a national government, Roosevelt writes, men looked to Hamilton to help in organizing the fruits of victory. He was elevated to a position of leadership in the councils of the great. It was out of this responsibility, we didn't have a central government yet, years after the Revolution. It was out of this responsibility that he laid down the premise, quote, "The future of the country depends upon a new and sturdier union with a federal government and one man at its head. King George openly boasts that the republic soon will fall to pieces. His troops are on the Canadian frontier, and he is biding his time." Unquote. I don't think that's a quote from Hamilton. I think that's Franklin Roosevelt summarizing in a way that he often did, in a very acute way, what Hamilton is thinking and what he's doing, what he's up to. It was because, and he goes on, it was because of his insistence, Hamilton's insistence, that in May 1787, a convention met at Philadelphia to form a permanent union of the states. At this convention, he, Alexander Hamilton, brought Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and others to agreement with his principle that the government should consist of three branches: the President, Congress, and a Supreme Court. And it was out of this work of his mind evolved that document that has been the model for other nations and the bulwark of our own, the Constitution of the United States. And then he talks about how Hamilton fought for the ratification of the Constitution so that it would go into effect. States had to vote for it. And then finally, it said Washington made him the Treasury Secretary, the greatest of the cabinet offices. As he had stabilized the problems of state, so now he ordered the finances of the country. And it was his impetus that removed for all time the risk of disintegration of the states. None appreciated this solidarity more than Aaron Burr, who defeated for the presidency in his race against Jefferson, largely through the efforts of Hamilton. That is, Hamilton actually got Jefferson into the presidency rather than somebody worse, because he was a patriot, rather than John Adams again, or this traitor Aaron Burr. So Aaron Burr, who defeated for the presidency in his race against Jefferson, sought in this greater financial security that Hamilton had made in the country, the banishment of his dream of establishing a Northern Confederacy. Burr had made a deal with traders in New England to break up the country, and Hamilton undercut that and stopped him. Burr, seizing upon the pretext of insult in the campaign utterances of Hamilton, challenged him to a duel. And then he talks about his graveyard in New York. So that's his picture of Alexander Hamilton. In the same year, 1825, Franklin Roosevelt wrote a review of a new book that came out about the fight between Jefferson and Hamilton. And in this review, he takes the side of Jefferson. If you have no idea about American history, then you can't figure out anything about what he's doing there. He says that Hamilton, in the position of a leader of the Federalist Party, that party was aligned with the moneyed classes and the aristocracy. Jefferson, he doesn't really go into the attack about the Bank of the United States or any of those details. He just says that Jefferson mobilized the people of the country to go against those moneyed classes that were more and more in control of the federal government under the Federalist Party. What is FDR doing when he's saying this? He is saying, I'm going to do that same thing. I am going to mobilize the people of the country to take away the rule over this country by the moneyed classes. I'm not going to pull down people who have money. I'm not going to pull down owners of property. I'm going to take away the power over the nation by these longtime traders in Wall Street who trace themselves back to Aaron Burr and to this whole British connection. There's an axis between London and Wall Street. That's pure treason. It's always been that. They never built anything in this country. Nothing. And he knew it. He understood this. In the Democratic Party of this time, it was still the party of treason from earlier times. It was largely under the control of Southern racists and Wall Street in combination, just before the Civil War. So he reached out as a young political leader. He's reaching out to people in the South who might back him for leader of the country around a theme of Thomas Jefferson, who's a big idol in the South. Jefferson is a very mixed individual. So that's on the question of Hamilton and Jefferson. But be clear, because what FDR ended up doing as governor and as president was reviving Alexander Hamilton's policies, full scale. And he brought about the third phase of the industrialization of the country along those same lines, the American system. Just go through a few of the things that I found in the library. he brought in, early on while he's recovering from polio, he brought in William Jennings Bryan, who had run for president much earlier, for visits with him. And this is a guy who had challenged J.P. Morgan at the Democratic Convention back in 1912. He directly and by name challenged J.P. Morgan, August Belmont, and other, oligarchs on Wall Street, and say they should not, we must not endorse any candidate controlled by them. And that resolution caused panic and pandemonium in 1912. So he is getting in touch with William Jennings Bryan. He wrote a movie scenario, and I found the movie scenario written by Franklin Delano Roosevelt during this period of recovery. It was a scenario for a movie about John Paul Jones, who was the most famous of the heroic naval commanders for the American Revolution, and very defiant of the British. And he in that scenario, he actually talks about how John Paul Jones came from Scotland, but he was in the West Indies and he saw slavery there, and he was starting to work for it on a slave ship, and he said, "This is disgusting. I'm not going to have anything to do with this." So he brings this out in this movie. It's not a script, but it's a very detailed plan for a movie. It was actually submitted to Hollywood. They didn't go for it, but somebody should. And he brings out in that movie scenario how Benjamin Franklin was stationed in France, was actually running the command of John Paul Jones from Paris. Franklin advised John Paul Jones to go up into Britain and kidnap some aristocrats and trade them for American prisoners of war. And he tried it. It almost worked. He wrote about the Renaissance in a little history of the United States that he began. I read it. It's only a few pages. He didn't get very much of it done. But in this work, he's talking, he doesn't even get to the beyond, I don't even think he even gets to Columbus, but he just talks about what led up to Columbus. And he says that the French king, Louis XI, put down the power of the great nobles, the barons of France, and made himself a king that could, bring progress and scientific ideas to the people. Nobody knows that today. Very few know about this, and in fact, that king is slandered ever since then by the enemy, Louis XI of France. Franklin Roosevelt wrote a plan in 1923 or 24 called A Plan to Preserve World Peace. And this was to go back to the League of Nations and change it to be something like what we really need and what the United Nations was supposed to be later on. He called it the Society of Nations. They should have the power to invent, and it would be an executive committee, the great powers of the world, working together in harmony, and the other countries in the General Assembly. They should have the power to investigate labor conditions, to investigate just treatment of native inhabitants, to investigate dope trafficking, arms trade, prevention of disease. They should have the power to act against wars that are started for the purpose of debt collection. And he says explicitly, for all you populist people, he says, there is absolutely nothing in this to limit the constitutional powers of the member nations. This is not a world government. This is a voluntary association of friendly countries. acting as nations, like adults.
What year was that written?
In 1923 or 24. He can't remember, and he writes a note about that. He actually put this back into his library in 1944 when he's thinking about doing this again. In 1924, 3 years after he got polio, Al Smith, who had just been elected for 2 years as governor of New York, asked Franklin Roosevelt to nominate him for president of the United States. And also he ran, just in case he didn't win, he was running for re-election as governor. So at this time you can see a real split with the Teddy Roosevelt family. The nominee for governor for the Republicans was Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of the former president. And this was Eleanor Roosevelt's first cousin. And they said, this guy is no good. Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor said, this guy is no good, he's corrupt. And Eleanor Roosevelt went all around New York State with a car decked out with a teapot dome smokestack on it to call attention to the scandals that this TR's son had been involved in as a no-goodnik. And she did that because he said about Franklin Roosevelt, he's a maverick, he doesn't wear the brand of our family. So, in this period, Franklin Roosevelt began organizing a vast network of Democrats throughout the country, political leaders, local people, somewhat like we're doing in the Keisha campaign. Now, to take control of the Democratic Party. He said, the Republican leadership stands for the control of the social and economic structure of the nation by a small minority of hand-picked associates. And so he had a plan to reorganize the whole party. And that plan was put down by the leader of the party at that time, 1924, John Davis, who was a Morgan lawyer. And it was also put down by the New York Times and Adolph Ochs, who ran that party. He's in the Sulzberger family. So this is Wall Street saying, no, we want the Democrats to be a minority party and just absorb any popular feeling that might come up against the Republicans. We don't want the Democrats to go out of business, but we don't want them to run the country, especially with somebody like Franklin Roosevelt running it. So in 1926, let's see if I get this one. This gives you an idea of who the enemy is and what they're up to. This is a report to Franklin Roosevelt that I found. It's in the papers of Louis Howe, H-O-W-E, his longtime personal aide. And this is a report that Louis Howe got together for him in 1926 about Benito Mussolini, who had for a few years been the fascist leader of Italy. And his debts were due, and there was a whole question about how the U.S. should orient itself to collecting those debts. And so this is his report. He said, the attitude of the Morgans, that's the J.P. Morgan Bank, that was started in England, it was brought over here to try to wreck the United States and take control of it. That's their background. So he says, the attitude of the Morgans was that the immediate settlement of the debt was necessary. That is, let Mussolini have some slack. To permit Italy to borrow the money needed for the restoration of business. And that the strong financial powers, that is the big bankers, which had created and upheld Mussolini so far, would be able to control him or even depose him if necessary without endangering the peace of Europe. Well, where did fascism come from? It came from this Wall Street London axis. Did FDR know that? Yes, that's what he's basing this, he's putting that into his consideration of the meaning of the United States as he immerses himself, especially in the American Revolution. Oops. Oh. Can you help me with this? It seems to be, oh, here we go. Okay, there it is. In 1927, his former boss, Josephus Daniels, who had been the Secretary of the Navy and helped train Franklin Roosevelt, published an article in the New York American, one of the newspapers of the day, exposing the British. And he was in the middle of this. He was the U.S. Secretary of the Navy at that time, back during World War I. So he says that at the end of the war, World War I, the British tried to blackmail the United States to say, you have to cut down your navy so that Britain's navy can rule the world, or else we won't agree to the League of Nations. And he goes through the whole background of this thing. And then he talks about how the British got their objective of cutting down the U.S. Navy at a conference that was just held in Washington in 1922, after this thing. So he's exposing the British. Okay, now, I hope this, yes. All right, now you can't see this, but I'm going to read you this. This was a memorandum that's just sitting there in the file, written by Franklin Roosevelt. July 6, 1928. Memorandum. This is about leadership. Take this to heart. There is no magic in democracy that does away with the need of leadership. The danger of our democracy lies in our tendency to select leaders who are similar to the rank and file of us, whereas the hope of democracy seems to lie in our selecting leaders who are superior to the rank and file of us. Should we hunt for leaders who will lead us, or for leaders who will follow us? Should we look for leaders who will always think like us, or for leaders who will sometimes think for us? Should we elect men to office because they promise to vote for certain measures, or because we can trust their minds and their morals to guide them aright on measures in general once all the facts are before them? Shall leaders be human substitutes for their constituents, or phonograph records of the fluctuating moods of their constituents? No man of authentic greatness of mind and character will purchase political position at the price of adjourning his own intelligence and becoming the errand boy of either Main Street or Wall Street. We have today, side by side, an old political order fashioned by a pastoral civilization with farming, and a new social order fashioned by a technical civilization. The two are maladjusted. Their creative interrelation is one of the big tasks ahead of American leadership. In other words, the U.S. is pretty well screwed up in its economy and its social system. In 1925, so how did FDR stand on these issues that LaRouche always talks about, the American system? Well, we know about Hamilton, what he thought about Hamilton. How about free trade? Because he had been talking about lowering tariffs in that period. And he answers a letter saying, Republican speakers are still trying to tell the people that the Democratic Party stands for free trade. That means the dumping of European and Oriental goods on our markets, and the formation of bread lines and soup kitchens in every city of the United States. The Democratic Party does not believe in free trade. It believes in a tariff, primarily for revenue, but also for the protection and encouragement of certain industries which have a proper economic place in our midst. We are opposed to dumping and the destruction of American industries. The average man is afraid that a Democratic tariff means a closing of all our factories. And he goes on to say, we just don't want the tariff to be used by people like Rockefeller to get unfair prices, things like that. Mm-hmm. But free trade is wrong. That's his point of view. In 1928, when Al Smith ran for president, I'll get to this in a second, he appointed a representative of the Morgans named Raskob to be head of the Democratic Party. Al Smith. He's the Democratic nominee for president. So he appointed this guy, Raskob. And Franklin Roosevelt said, this is wrong. He represents the moneyed interest, as in essence, Morgan. In 1929, when he was governor, he gave a speech on July 4th, 1929, at Tammany Hall, where he said that we may be in a new feudalism, and we have the control by Morgan and others. He's distinctly attacking Morgan. There's other financiers, but Morgan is the chief of this axis with Britain. And he says, we may need a new Declaration of Independence. When he ran for president, this is what he said to kids at a university. We need enthusiasm, imagination, and the ability to face facts, even unpleasant ones, bravely. We need to correct, by drastic means if necessary, the faults in our economic system from which we now suffer. We need the courage of the young. Yours is not the task of making your way in the world. It's not how to better yourself, but the task of remaking the world which you will find before you. That's his challenge, yeah.
What year is this?
That's when he's running for president in 1932. To get the nomination, he had to defeat the chairman of the Democratic Party, Raskob, who was run by Morgan, who was a financier with Morgan. So he defeated the leadership of the Democratic Party because both parties were in control of the same people. He said, let's use the Democratic Party and make it what I'm going to do with it, which is to have a complete growth of the jobs and the industries. And by that time, when he was running for president, there, of course, was a terrible crash and depression in the United States. So what did he do as president that reflects this? 90% of the people in farms and in rural areas had no electricity when he came into office. And by the time he was finished, that was completely reversed. Electricity had been brought to people throughout the country. Part of the way that was done was with the federal government building the dams in Tennessee. They also built the Grand Coulee Dam out in Washington, and other massive projects to develop electricity and flood control. The New Deal built over 11,000 water treatment plants and pumping stations, laid thousands of miles of sewers and water mains. Why? Because people in much of the country had no running water. They had sewage lying around. They had polluted water. We were living in a backward state, even though all these inventions had been made. In much of them from the 19th century. This is already 1933 when he came in. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal built or renovated about 50,000 schools and over 600 college and university buildings. Places that didn't have schools at all. They built or reinforced over 170,000 bridges across the country. They built or improved 650,000 miles of roads in the United States. People talk about the Eisenhower, interstate highway program. That's a good program, but nothing like this. Another 59,000 miles of sidewalks and curbing laid alongside the roads. Airplanes had been invented by the Wright brothers in the early 20th century, but no one was flying on those airplanes except stunt pilots and airmail guys. So we needed to have airports. So the federal government had a program to build those. They built over 4,000 modern airport buildings and over 7 million feet of runway. They built 15,000 courthouses, city halls, and other public administration buildings, and you can see these things still in operation in many parts of the country. They put in a minimum wage for the first time. They put in unemployment insurance for the first time. If you didn't have a job, you're supposed to starve. If you got old and had nothing, you just die in the dust. Well, how do you think the public reacted to those programs? The public supported what he was doing and elected him 4 times for president. Not 2, 4. Like they came to support Lincoln before him. People were being thrown out of their houses. And so he set up agencies to take care of their mortgages so they wouldn't lose their homes. How popular was that? Here is Franklin Roosevelt saying to the villain, don't take this lady's mortgage house away from her. You hear something said that he didn't really solve the Depression. Only the war solved the Depression. Somebody says, oh, well, war is our guarantee of good times. Stupid. That's Karl Marx may have said that, or some capitalist may have said that. But look at the unemployment on the red there. It went down. It had a temporary uptick in 1937. He was fighting all the way against these bankers and continually pushing to expand the services that would give people the ability to work and to live, and credit for industry to get production going. When he was president, he saw that Mexico was copying him. They had a president, Cardenas, who was doing a New Deal in Mexico. And so the Mexicans were not rich, even though they had riches of resources. The resources were controlled by Standard Oil of the US and Shell Oil of England. And so they weren't even producing much of that oil. They just owned it. And so the president of Mexico seized the oil lands and the properties. He wanted to pay them for it, but not as much as they demanded. He said, I'm taking them over. How did Franklin Roosevelt react to that? Well, his ambassador, who was this old, remember the guy that exposed Britain? Josephus Daniels, and earlier was trying to stop the war. He didn't want the World War I. He's now ambassador to Mexico. He's an old guy. He approved of what the Mexicans were doing, and so did Franklin Roosevelt. So when Standard Oil and Shell Oil demanded that we go to war with Mexico to get back, quote, our, unquote, oil wells, he said, no, they're perfectly in their power to appropriate that. I don't want people to think that I believe in not paying for what you take over, and they should pay a fair price. And he helped to negotiate a fair price, which was way less than what the oil companies said. So this is Franklin Roosevelt in his recovery from polio and in his presidency. He is doing something, in one sense, he's doing what had been done earlier, at the beginning of the 19th century, when leaders like John Quincy Adams and Matthew Carey and others revived Hamilton and started building industry in the United States under Hamilton's program. And they said they were Jeffersonians. He's doing this again. But he, unlike those people, but similar to Lincoln, but even more powerfully than Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt went directly to the people of the United States. He started doing that when he was recovering, when he was he couldn't walk, by letter and telegram, and bringing hundreds of people to meet him from around the country. Then he did it on the radio when he was governor. He would have radio broadcasts to the people, and they'd gather around their firesides and listen to the governor, because he was telling them exactly what was going on. Explosive things what were happening inside the government, and how he had to get the interest of the progress of the people, such as building public electricity stations to generate electricity, so that people in New York can pay a low price for electricity. Why pay 8 times what it's worth? Ridiculous. Just build some hydroelectric stations. There's plenty of water power here to do that. But he went on the radio to get the people on his side. And then when he was president, he mobilized people again and again, going around the parties, going around the established politicians. That's what we are doing now. We don't have the presidency, but it's that spirit and that idea that is going to get us out of this catastrophe. So that's it. So I'll entertain questions. Yeah.
I find this, I don't know whether you want to call it a discovery,
Yeah.
very exciting. And one of the first questions I have is, this document of FDR's about Hamilton, is it possible to actually go in there and make copies?
I have a copy of it. I'm going to put it. We're going to publish this.
Ah,
stuff. Oh yeah. I made copies of every relevant thing.
My other
Some of
question-
it you see sitting in. You'll see it. But anyway, it's I've identified these things, and it has to be put in circulation for sure. Yeah.
Now, you said in 1932, when he was talking about that the country needed another Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
I mean, I assume that he was serious about that. Or was that just a phrase?
It was a
or?
question that he asked. Do we need that? But he's absolutely serious about it, because what he's saying is that we have lost the constitutional arrangement of our country, which is that the government exists for the purpose of improving the life of the citizens, not serving private powers who are trying to destroy the country. So we need to put out a revolutionary concept in the minds of the people that resumes what we were doing at the founding of the country. Yes, he really seriously meant it. And you don't have to make a declaration, but that's what you're doing. That's the spirit, and that's the idea of this whole campaign for the presidency. You know, read his inaugural address. He's talking about those money powers that caused this disaster. Do you think George Bush or Barack Obama is going to say anything like that? No, because they're owned by these guys directly. They're so stupid also that they don't even know. You know, beyond knowing, Barack Obama knows that he is doing something wrong. He knows that for sure. But he doesn't really understand the background of that. He just knows that he has made himself a whore for those financiers. That's what he knows. He learned how to do that at Harvard. George W. Bush, who knows what he knows? He had too much cocaine and liquor when he was a younger man. I don't know what he knows, but he's in that awful family. So, Fred.
It's like what you're discussing with FDR on this question of leadership and so forth. But what he's trying to rally people with, it's like it's never this idea of going at it from by being popular and so forth. You know, but really laying down what the responsibility is in terms of being a citizen and so forth, and going through all of this and saying this is your responsibility.
Right. We're going to alter what's popular. And you always have to start any scientific endeavor by attacking popular opinion and create a new situation to make any kind of progress in science or in politics. You know, sometimes he spoke what appeared to be favorably about Andrew Jackson, who was one of the worst demagogues in our history, who said he represented the people. I'm just like you. I'm illiterate like you. You know, I kill Indians like you, and so forth. Why did FDR say that? The way he phrased it, he said, Andrew Jackson was very popular with the people. He was attacked by the money powers. He was attacked by the tired intellectuals. He was attacked by this and that power center. And you could see from the way he's talking and from the audience that he's talking about himself, right? He's not saying anything in favor of what Andrew Jackson actually stood for. Andrew Jackson stood for exactly the opposite of Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt said, let us use the government and the nation to accomplish the good of the people. Andrew Jackson said, I forbid that. The government should have no power. The only power should be private power. And guess what? That's not the man in the street. He didn't say that, but there are private powers at that time and now, and they will rule the world unless we have an elected government that gets in their way. That's as simple as that. Yeah.
Not this question. When I understood, they said Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a great president. But now, I'm confused with it. He was supposed to have done so much,
Yeah.
right? You
Yes.
know.
He did so much. He did a lot. Yes.
Oh, all right. Maybe
Yeah.
I misunderstood it. That you were saying that he wasn't that great.
I'm sorry that you got that impression. I don't think
Because
that's.
I know he was a wonderful man.
He was. He was a man who made modern America what it was
I remember what he said,
in a
and
good sense.
I lived by something he said.
Yeah.
You gotta crawl before you walk. And as my son was growing up, he didn't want, he's president of a company right now. And I tell him, you gotta crawl before you walk, Michael, and then you'll make it. If you don't, then you won't make it. And he made it.
Yeah, when he was in 1924, when he had, everybody in politics knew that he had been crippled by polio. And they didn't know really what his state, whether he would ever have anything, recover or have anything to do with the country again. So Al Smith asked him to nominate him for president at the Democratic Convention. And he staged the whole thing. He had a physical therapist teach him how to walk with canes and holding on to somebody so that it looked different than somebody flailing around and acting crippled and crazy. So that it'd be dignified, and so people wouldn't just say, well, that's the agenda here, is looking at this cripple. So he walked very slowly, but without, I think he might have even slipped at one point, got up and just kept going. And it took a while for him to get up to the podium. And he was always smiling. He never complained about his situation, never. And so when he did his speech, people were on their feet applauding, and they said, this is a man of courage. He's a man of principle. And his speech about Al Smith was more important than Al Smith's campaign. Al Smith didn't get elected, and Roosevelt was a better man than Al Smith. You got to crawl before you walk. Well, some people are already walking, and then they start crawling. Unfortunately, they go the wrong direction. Yeah.
Well, the war alone didn't bring us out of the Depression.
That's right.
But if you had to put a percentage on it, what would you say that the things that Roosevelt did was more percentage that led us out of the Depression, or was the war more percentage, or was it like an even percentage, 50-50, the Roosevelt and the war that led us out of the
Well,
Depression?
first of all, people today have the wrong idea about World War II to start with. They think that you just had these democracies and they were attacked by these Nazis. That's not what happened. The United States of America was led by a man who believed in our Constitution and in the freedom of our country and the advancement of mankind. The British and the French were led by people who favored fascism.
That's right.
And they supported Hitler right up to even after the beginning of the war. Franklin Roosevelt continually put pressure on the British to stop supporting Hitler. You had this guy Chamberlain as the Prime Minister, and the aristocrats like Halifax, and they were working to promote the Nazis when the Nazis went into Czechoslovakia in 1938. They divided up the loot with England. They had British bankers and corporations and arms dealers taking loot out of Czechoslovakia. So Roosevelt put more and more pressure on them. You have to change your policy because Hitler's making war on Europe. I don't want a war. He was trying to stop a world war by stopping Hitler before we get in a war. And the way to stop him was not to make appeals to Hitler, although he did that. It's putting pressure on the British, primarily, to stop sponsoring Hitler and giving money to them. And the same thing with these Wall Street bankers, which included Prescott Bush, Morgan Chase, and all these guys that are today these goofballs that have ruined the world, ruined our economy. It's over. That's the same people that backed Hitler, and he's going against them. So Roosevelt, first of all, changed the rules of the economy back to a constitutional basis to start with the Glass-Steagall Act and other rules that says bankers are not allowed to grab control of all the resources and throw them into the ocean with speculation. They're not allowed simply to dominate our policies by having piles of money. We have an elected government that has a mission to build up the power of the country. And he did long-term development like infrastructure all over the country. What do you mean get out of the Depression? Well, for one thing, we recovered from the crash under Roosevelt. We also put a floor under the life of the people so that they were not going to die if they came into hard times. And trying to get the life of people permanently raised by, for example, in the 7 southern states, Alabama and others, building those dams, building electric distribution, building schools, encouraging the building of factories and private farms. So he did all that stuff. The unemployment rate in industrial production went down. It briefly went up, and then it went down again. Roosevelt was the one who began the mobilization of our industry to begin sending equipment over to the people fighting Hitler, which by that time were the British and the Russians. And that mobilization of our industry added fuel. And that was done in a way that the bankers could not break it up. Because, what had led, you don't need a war to do that, but you need some political way of defeating the power of the bankers. Our job now is to finish the job. In a sense, in my view, finish World War II before we get World War III. We never finished it. We never closed down those centers that had brought us Hitler and Mussolini, as they are admitting. You saw that memo from Louis Howe in 1926. That's before Hitler took over Germany, copying Mussolini. So it was Roosevelt that did end the Depression. If he hadn't been president, what would he have had? We would have had a fascist world that would be in a permanent depression, and that would have ended with a dark age. Now, he also supervised the development of the atomic bomb in the Manhattan Project. People only think about the bomb, which he didn't drop on Japan, that was Harry Truman. But they don't think about the fact that that was also the beginning of the power of man to use nuclear science for good purposes. And that is the power of the future. That's what John Kennedy made his central energy program, to develop nuclear power and breeder reactors and recycle the waste and spread that all over the world. Have the Israelis and Arabs do that instead of developing A-bombs. So Roosevelt started these things. Roosevelt was the one who got us out of the Depression, for sure. Got us out of the control, at least for a time, of these bankers. When he died, he was replaced by a man that the Churchill and friends had put into the vice presidency, Harry Truman, who reversed much of what Roosevelt did and put us into a Cold War with Russia, which we're now back at. Stupid.
It's also true that we have to remember that Glass-Steagall was 1933.
That's right. That's one of the first things he
did. He did
did.
not get into the war until 41 with Pearl Harbor.
Right. Yes, of course. He did these measures immediately.
Long before.
That's right. That's right. For somebody to say, as people who will say that to you, oh well, it was really mostly the war that got us out of the Depression. They're not even interested, if they say that, in looking into what was the mission of Franklin Roosevelt. What was he trying to do? Did he succeed in what he was trying to do? If you're not interested in trying to see it from his standpoint, you're not studying the subject. You can also look into his critics, but you have to start with what a man thinks and does, or else it's just stupid. Right?
Right.
Well, I think he succeeded until he died and Truman came in, and then Truman reversed.
That's true. He did
all
reverse.
his accomplishments, or most of his accomplishments.
I agree with
It
you.
went on from there.
Go ahead. Yeah. You bet.
Roosevelt's significant logistical push was in 36 and 37, we created the 4 Maritime Acts, by which he provided for the logistics by which they could do sea lift for World War II.
What was in the Maritime Acts?
It was the Maritime Act 1936.
What did that provide for?
The merchant marine had been depleted and completely put down by the Depression.
Yeah.
We were building, like, in the United States, 1 ship a year.
Uh-huh.
And he put in the Maritime Acts in 37 that began the building of the ships. And within a year or so, we were building 20 ships.
Yeah, that's way
And
before the war.
A year
There's no
after
war.
that, we were building about 25. By about 1938 and 39, we were building about 75 ships
Wow.
a year to 150.
And those are commercial cargo carriers.
Yeah, yeah, this
Is that
cargo
right?
carriers, he was building the logistics because, you know, foreign aid and other things couldn't get where it was going unless you could deliver it.
Yeah.
And at that time, the only delivery systems you had were strictly vessels that could operate on oceans.
Yeah, great. That's
And
great.
This is what Roosevelt did that was of significance.
Would you do me a
Because-
favor? Do me a
What?
favor, get in touch later and send me a note on that, will you? To give me that, just the synopsis of that stuff that you were just
Yeah.
talking about, okay?
Because-
Do that?
Because this is part of what, you know, without this, Britain would have been rolled over because they would have had nothing.
Right,
Because the Lend-Lease only gave them the World War I 4 stack destroyers that the, you know,
Yeah, but we
the
sent them
British
other
Navy
stuff.
used as replacements for the craft they had lost to the Germans.
yeah.
Also, before the war, they were short of, one type of ship they really need was the aircraft carriers. And they had to throw something together real quick, right after Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
We lost a few of those things. And they had to have a better delivery system to supply Russia. You know, because Russia was in the war too, and
Yes.
they need arms.
That's right,
Now, how are we going to get the arms to Russia?
yeah.
The land bridge. They fly them over from Alaska.
They did.
Yeah, they built a
used
highway.
some of those means, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me say something about this thing, about the, in California, they had Henry Kaiser. He had these shipyards, and during the war, he produced these huge quantities of cargo carriers for the military and other ships. His son was the one that worked with John Kennedy to help develop Africa, to build the great dam in Ghana, the greatest hydroelectric project in Africa. I want to go back to this idea about Russia. We supplied Russia with, I think, about 10% of their equipment fighting the Nazis. The Germans invaded them. Before Pearl Harbor, they invaded Russia. So they were fighting like hell against Russia. Now, what was our idea about Russia? They were a communist government. They had been that since 1917. But before that, from the beginning of our country, we had been allies with Russia. They were our greatest ally. Look up John Paul Jones. After he did these terrific raids on the British Isles and scared the hell out of them, took the war right to Britain. When that war was over, the revolution, he signed on as a rear admiral in the navy of Empress Catherine, the Tsarina of Russia, in the Russian Navy. And he was sailing in the Black Sea around the Crimean Peninsula. Russia was our ally in the revolution. Russia helped organize the other European countries to stay out of Britain's orbit in that war. American engineers went to Russia in the 1840s to build the first railroads in Russia. In the Civil War, the Russians sent their fleet here to demonstrate to the British and French they better not mess around and take the side of the Confederacy. After that war, we built warships for Russia in America, in Philadelphia and elsewhere. And then our transcontinental railroad was copied by the Russians, and they got American locomotives. This is our background with Russia. This is a sister nation, both big countries. Do we like their government back when they were communists? No. Did we like their government when they were czars? No. Lincoln said bad thing about czars, but he was a friend of the Tsar, Alexander II, who was trying to do some good. He's an adult. What does an adult do? He tries to, he doesn't go on prejudice. He doesn't go on, oh, this is the enemy. There's no nation that's our enemy. And the Russians have been traditionally a nation that saw their interest as completely lined up with the United States as a great nation that can accomplish great things against the will of these financiers that would crush everybody. Yeah.
What's your opinion of FDR and Stalin?
They were friends for good reasons, for that very reason that I just said. FDR went to meet Stalin repeatedly, found that he could work with him, and they were friends. And if the United States had continued, if FDR had lived or had been replaced by somebody who was decent, who carried on his thinking, then there would not have been a Cold War. The Cold War was imposed by the British and Wall Street. And it was imposed to block American influence in the world. Does that sound strange? What's American influence? You go out to Africa, Asia, South America, or Europe, where they have problems, especially in the poorer countries, and you show them what American inventions and technology have accomplished. We will share it with you. It's not even foreign aid. FDR had a meeting with Stalin in Iran. It's called Persia at the time, in Tehran, the capital, 1943. And while he was there, he had his aide, General Pat Hurley, write a report about what we're going to do to develop Iran without a cost of a penny to the American taxpayers. Just let them use their own resources that are being stolen by the British. British BP, remember that? British Petroleum. That was then called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, earlier known as Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And they dominated that country. So he said, let the Persians have their own resources, and we will help them to use those resources to develop out of being the poorest country in the world at that time to being a model, an example for the world. Let them do it, and we'll be their partners. We're not going to take it over. There are some countries that we could be in control of for a short time as a trustee. And do you know that Ho Chi Minh asked us to do that in Vietnam? He said, do in Vietnam what you did in Philippines. No thanks to Teddy Roosevelt, but the best that we did in Philippines, not the worst. Yeah. Oh, here. Yeah.
I noticed that you were talking that the geopolitics of FDR's time and the present seem to have a lot of similarities. Can you tell us how the Crimean War and the UK and NATO and the US figure into what's going on now as opposed to what was going on during the Crimean War?
The Crimean War takes place in the Crimea, this peninsula in the Black Sea coming down from southern Russia into the Black Sea. Black Sea is an arm of the Mediterranean. And this took place in 1854, I think 54 and 55, where the British, and they brought the French in also, invaded Russia to try to stop them from having influence in that region and to cripple their access to the warm water of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. They were also, the Russians were in a conflict with Turkey at the time, which was called the Ottoman Empire. And the British wanted to gobble up and eat the Ottoman Empire, so they didn't want the Russians meddling. If the Russians got too far down into the Mediterranean area with their influence, the British would have trouble controlling India because their control goes through Egypt, goes through all those countries. So they invaded Russia. And this was a horrible, stupid war. I mean, you couldn't think of a more stupid. Did Russia invade England? No. It was obviously an aggression by the British. That was where the cigarette was invented. The first cigarettes were invented there by the British Army using Turkish tobacco. And they made a machine to roll cigarettes automatically and give them out to their, sort of like a mild dope for their soldiers, so they'd be happier doing this ugly crime. And how did America react? Henry Carey, the great economic nationalist carrying on the tradition of Franklin and Hamilton, Henry Carey wrote articles in the New York newspapers taking the side of the Russians and explaining to the Americans why we should take Russian side. And America was on Russia's side. The London Times was bitterly complaining that Americans took the side of the East against the West. Well, we are the West, baby. We are the West, not you. Is the East India Company the West? No, they got the idea of empires from the worst features of the old East, of the empires of old time, where one man or 100 men would rule over everybody else, treat them like dogs. That's not Western. Western is man's dignity. So we took Russia's side. One of the members of the DuPont family went on a boat to carry arms into Russia. Almost got killed in that conflict. And it was in that conflict that Alexander II first came into being Tsar of Russia. And he saw how weak Russia was by following free trade. And he said, America is a pattern. So a few years later, when Lincoln became president, he freed the slaves in Russia, called serfs. And it was a great ally of ours. So now, we are doing in Ukraine the same thing that was done by Hitler and the British together at the beginning of World War II. We are backing Nazis, real Nazis, to cause a war. If you try to explain it by saying we want to take over the Ukraine or something, or have our own government there, or take away what they have, Ukraine is impoverished. The whole system of Europe is broken down, and there's terrible poverty, especially on the fringe countries. And they're demanding of the Ukrainians from Europe that they should starve. That's not going to work out. That's not a long-term, it's not even a long-term program. It's just done to get a war with the Russians. They know that if we were to succeed there, the next thing would be that we would break up Russia. We'd have the same gangs going into Russia and into China as well. And they have separatists all over those countries. So you have to go back to Franklin Roosevelt. It's no good considering this just from the standpoint of the enemy. You don't understand it. You have to go back and look at it from the standpoint of George Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. And some other great national leaders like Juarez in Mexico and others who fought, or the guys that made the unification of Italy. They fought for a great nation. And we said that nations have the right to protect their citizens and to be friends with other countries. And the people that were put into power by the riots and the terrorism in Ukraine just recently their main objective was to put Ukraine against Russia. Imagine if the Russians, imagine if communists took over Russia. Imagine, just think about it as a science fiction thing. Maybe a communist party came back and took over Russia. And they're embittered. And so they send their squads into Mexico and Canada. They pay people in those countries, like we've been paying people in Ukraine, to teach them about civic government, meaning overthrowing this government and aligning it with Europe. So they would pay people in Mexico and Canada to throw off the yoke of the United States, close down American military bases in Canada, and get people who hate America go up to the border of the United States in armed gangs in Mexico. How would be our response to that? We'd go to war right away with Russia, right? Or at least we'd say this has to be stopped. That's what we are doing. So all of our greatest leaders have fought against precisely what this stands for. Even when the Russians made this provocation in Cuba with their missiles, remember, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev put his missiles in Cuba. Why? I think because Kennedy was making our country so strong by building up our industry as well as the military and our science that they would fall behind even though they were temporarily headed in space. And so he said, well, maybe I should, or maybe he was thinking, if we put these missiles that are threatening the US from 90 miles away, maybe America will back down. And Kennedy said, no, you can't do that. And he stood up to him, but he did it in a way that didn't humiliate the Russians and didn't cause a war, despite some crazy people saying, yeah, let's go to war, let's teach them. We'll teach them. They can't do that to us, let's teach them. Oh, is a nuclear war going to teach anybody anything? It's like the Catholics and the Protestants used to teach people in Europe. They would go into the neighboring city that was the other religion, so-called the other religion. Sounds to me like they're the same religion, but so they go in the enemy's town and commit some outrage. So the enemy then says, well, we'll teach them never to do that again. You got to be tough. So they go in there and kill the children. Oh, we'll teach them, they can't get away with this, and they keep doing this revenge. And of course, the people who are in charge of making sure no thinking person gets in control are laughing at the people of Europe as they kill each other. Right. People in Venice. Until they sorted it out and said, no more revenge. Don't be stupid. You're being used. War is not necessary. Ever, really. Right. Why, you say, well, wasn't it necessary to stop Hitler? Yeah, long before World War II started. When he should have been stopped. When Wall Street started paying him. Yeah, Daniel.
So I wanted to ask you to say more about what you were saying about the consonance between FDR's method of taking over the Democratic Party and what we're doing right now. Because when you were talking about that, I was thinking about some of the things that Lyndon LaRouche continued was referring to from the recent period. One is when, I guess it was, September of 2012, when we started to move the younger organizers from Purcellville into DC on a standard basis, so that now the basement team and members of the Purcellville contingent are constantly in Washington, D.C., and he's been saying that had a big effect. And then in the state legislatures, which of course we saw break in like June of 2013, when the California state legislature started to receive letters from, J.P. Morgan representatives saying, are you going to really stick with Lyndon LaRouche's, resolution? Are you going to go with Lyndon LaRouche? And Lynn keeps saying, they got terrified. So those have clearly been flanks that have been successful in one way or another. And I'm just trying to think through how the Keisha Rogers, Michael Steger campaign, what is it that we have to do next on that would escalate?
You have to look at why Roosevelt was successful in his political organizing. He was able to master, program, and complex subjects and present them to people in a way that they could understand. And it means that you're able to present something that is not something they already know in a way that raises their thinking. But it is something where you are, for example, I'd say there's a couple of things that you have to challenge. One thing is the concept of Wall Street and what it represents. And I think this has to be developed somewhat more. I'm going to try to do that too. But this is not, you know, somebody will say, that's our system. But they don't understand what it is. It's not our system. Our system is a constitution, and this is a private power that is not friendly to this country. They say, well, if you close down Wall Street, we won't have a job. They don't understand the relationship between Wall Street and corporations and businesses. The only kind of businesses that they actually support are businesses that are crushing or otherwise being parasites on the economy. They never created any industries. There's a lot of terror on the part of a person who's poorly educated, which is most people, that you either have communism or some variety of that, or you have Wall Street. Those are the two contending forces in the world. If that were true, we would have been dead long ago, because neither one of those invented modern times. So where does it come from? It doesn't come from them. So you have to be able to challenge history that's in people's minds. And if you're talking about current events, but it's not referencing that history, it's worthless, really. But just look at the way he does this. He will study things. In fact, somebody would write a draft of a speech, and he would completely change it to be able to get across to people what this means. And he didn't mince words. When he said, we're going after the people who act like kings with money, he said, this is the economic royalists. And he said who they were. Also, I think that we have to tear up the schools. We talked about this before, but I've done a lot more thinking about that. If people who are being trained to be bad teachers right now, and there are lots of them in the country, are told that there's an alternative, that we intend to revolutionize the teaching and not solve this or that problem of education. But people are not getting an education, and it's not just because of this or that problem. Is that the country as a whole is under the control of dark age freaks. And that's the economic system. And that's what the economic system requires of the children, to be dark age freaks, to be completely without any knowledge. So, for example, every subject in school, science, history, math, every subject should be taught from the standpoint of making discoveries by the students themselves. The professors should have already done that, and they should be in the process of making discoveries to overturn what people thought about these subjects before, or to relive what a scientist did or a statesman in the past to overturn the bad thinking of the past and make a progress and make a new insight. Every subject is only true if it's taught from that standpoint. You do it with biographies. You do it with a fight that's gone on for this republic idea throughout history. Yeah.
Mr. Chaitkin, do you think that, I know you're aware of the LaRouche's Harvard Yard?
Yeah, there was a video you're talking about, the Harvard Yard, yeah.
I think that should be resurfaced and given out.
Yeah.
Because that would let, especially the university kids that's stuck in there with the debt and with Glass-Steagall, me and Daniel talked about that, they should be first given a good dose of video of Harvard Yard, and then tell them about, you want to get out of that debt you're in, that debt you're going to owe,
Yeah.
and tell them about Glass-Steagall and come on board with us.
Yes.
That was just a thought.
Right.
Real quick, when you're talking about Wall Street and so forth, what Daniel was bringing up, you know, you get this idea that, you know, they take away industry and so forth, and, you know, blue collar workers and so forth, and white collar workers, and, you know, it's like, it becomes the idea that if you want respectability, you go over here. If you don't want respectability, you know, you don't want to be respected, you know, digging a ditch is not really respectable, this, that, the other, and you know, building things, you know, and that type of mentality has you know, been given to the population, I think also.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That would change if you had jobs that were easy jobs. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't think that Russia would want to have fight with us, because they have the same thing we have, and they know if it happened, the world would end.
That's right.
Or
I don't think
China,
they want a war.
they will not,
Definitely don't want a
there's
war.
no way. If you remember Khrushchev said, I'm gonna take over America, and he took a ship to the United Nations.
Yeah, remember, I will bury
and
you.
said
We will
that
bury
I
you.
will bury your country. He did, because he sent over all his people here. More Russians in Brooklyn, you got hearing it.
He sent them here?
No, they came here.
I don't think he sent
No,
them.
but I'm saying, Russia knows better than to play games.
Yeah.
They know that there's gonna be no world.
That's true, but at a certain point, as this keeps going with Obama there, and the Republicans as the cheering section saying, you have to back Obama because we promised to be worse than him. So therefore, you have to back Obama and we won't go first. Well, that's going on. Well, he pushes more and more. You get to a certain point where Russia calculates, if we don't fight back now, if we don't strike back, we'll be finished anyway. So we'll have to take a chance. So why get to that point? When you get to the point of a war catastrophe, events go out of control. And I think the greatest thing about Franklin Roosevelt, and this is similar, as I have seen, to two other presidents, Lincoln and Washington, the greatest thing of all about him is that beginning in about 1922, he decided to take responsibility for the human race. At least to take responsibility for the role of the United States in the world. And he came to understand that that would be putting the responsibility for what happened to the world on his shoulders. When you do that, you can't make major mistakes, because a mistake would be the death of everything. And so you have to act as the most mature, responsible person with the fate of everybody as if they were your children. That's a tremendous responsibility. And unfortunately, because we don't have somebody like that right now, waiting in the wings, an obvious person, although I believe there are many people who could become that rather quickly if we do the right things, if we mobilize the people in the right ways. But because we don't have that right now, each of us, as far as we're able, has to summon up that level of maturity and say, what happens to the world is up to me. One reason that you have to think that way is because young people, 25 and younger, today, in far too many cases, care nothing about the rest of the human race. They don't think about them. They don't know that anything exists. They don't care. If the world came to an end, they'd say whatever. That's too bad. But that's not everybody. Right now, it's our job. We're what they called in the Lincoln campaign for the president, we're the wide awakes. We go out with the torches and the drums and wake people up. But we are responsible beyond slogans. We're responsible for not making this terrible error where mankind goes into a ditch because it goes out of control. People think, well, they'll never let this happen or that happen. They, and the person who thinks that has all these stories in their head about what they are doing to poison our food or poison this or that. And they don't know the first thing about it. They don't care about it. They're not thinking about it because they are not competent. They're clever in certain ways, but they're playing dice with the future of the human race. They're no good. They're not going to save us. They will let things happen if they get out of control. And they're running it now so that it will get out of control, for sure, unless we stop them.
Okay, want to go maybe one last question?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, no.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things, the university systems, which used to be like non-profit, the private university systems, are now strictly profit-making enterprises, and the presidents of these various universities are all business people.
Charter schools.
In other words, instead of appointing a seasoned academic to head up the university, they are appointing businessmen who are doing it on a business basis, who have nothing for an academic background and no background at all to run an academic institution. And they come up with a system of adjunct professors who are grossly underpaid. They're paid by the course. They're not even regular employees, and they're shifted around from university to university, and they have to do like 4 courses, 4 different universities within one semester in order to make any sort of income, and most of them are receiving food stamps. People don't know this. You've got PhDs in this country receiving food stamps on problems, and this is going throughout the university systems, the private university systems. They're making such horrendous profits. They're making money hand over fist, and they're charging students tremendous amounts for these universities. And this is part of what's destroying the system.
Yeah. Well, we need, let me just answer. We need colleges and universities. It's like the Democratic Party. We need to use that party to get a good leadership. So we need the colleges and universities. Unfortunately,
Yeah, but you're not getting it, and you won't get it.
Hold on, okay? We need those universities and colleges or something like that.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the conceptions that rule all of academia
Yeah.
are generated from the same mind as is wrecking the economy and making man into a beast since the 60s.
Yeah.
So we need the colleges and universities,
Yes.
but we have to completely change what is the purpose of the
I agree with
colleges.
you 100%.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that you just said about us taking on the responsibility of behaving as mature adults and facing what we have to face in order to change this. I think everybody should remember, because I remind myself of it too, that the only reason we aren't blown up already is because LaRouche has certain networks within sphere of influence, and we're part of that have and Putin, who has been very mature and very very forward-thinking, and as far as the future is concerned, we have to look at Putin, who is the one who is really holding back, flanking maneuvers, handling this in a way that has not brought us to a war where we'd be blown up and wouldn't even know we're blown up yet until we're blown up. So we can't say that, that Russia is not going to do this, or Russia's not going to. They already have it done a whole lot. Okay? So we have to face this as that fact. It is Putin, it is LaRouche, it is us. It is those types of mechanisms that are preventing this from happening and have prevented it from happening to this point.
That's exactly right.
And that's why we have to take it beyond this point.
Yeah, we've
There won't
also,
be a future.
LaRouche since the 70s has energized and counseled and educated the leading military people and scientific people associated with them. And this is directly and indirectly with the ideas. so that they are able, in this dark age, to still somehow access reason as military leaders and to put the brakes on these crazy adventures. Brennan or somebody goes in, let's blow up this, blow up that, let's overthrow this. And they say, wait a minute, no, this is not in our national interest. This is crazy. This is insane. Yeah.
We better wrap it up at this point.
He's a patriot and wants to help people, but not the fighter for taking on the gods of Olympus, for taking on the powers on behalf of the people. He didn't really have that to begin with. And he told Frances Perkins, when he was president, she was the Secretary of Labor that he appointed, he said, I was a mean cuss when I first came into politics. He didn't particularly like people. He was just doing things as a so-called reformer. Let me see if this works. When he was he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He's the tall fellow. This is when he could walk. And the shorter guy is the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels. And I would encourage people to take a note or two so that you could look things up rather than say, well, this guy said so-and-so, I'm not sure about it, and go on to another subject, because this is all new. And you're going to have to think about this yourself so that you can help bring this about. Right? So this is the Secretary of the Navy in World War I, and he tried to stop the war. He was anti-imperialist. He didn't want the U.S. to go into that war on the side of Britain.
Tony, what was his name again?
Daniels, D-A-N-I-E-L-S, and he had a biblical first name, Josephus, J-O-S-E-P-H-U-S. And he taught FDR a lot. FDR called him chief because he worked for him at that time. And later on he made him, when FDR was president, he made this guy ambassador to Mexico because he was an anti-imperialist. But that's not the only influence at that time. Here is Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt, with Admiral William Sims, S-I-M-S. That's Admiral Sims. And he was the head honcho in the group of pro-British American military officers, particularly naval officers. So he was really happy to be in World War I. There. Oh, no. That's back. Okay, I'm just leaving. This is fine, yeah.
Okay, all right.
Okay. So this is the home of Franklin Roosevelt in Hyde Park, New York. And I took this picture when I was there this week, when I was walking on a path, taking a break from research, going down towards the Hudson. And this is looking up at the house. At that complex with his house is the Presidential Library and Museum that has the archives of Franklin Roosevelt. It has his personal letters, it has his political letters, his writings, the White House files. He set that up himself so that the public would have access to all these things in 1940 while he was president. That was the first presidential library. That sort of forced the other presidents later to do it, even though they weren't as good. Kennedy did a similar thing with his stuff in Massachusetts. So I spent 4 days there, and in preparation for that, I did a lot of study of the problem that seemed to present itself to me. There were two problems. One of them is that there are many different versions of what Franklin Roosevelt is politically that people believe. Some people say he's one thing, some people say he's another thing. And of course, as usual, the people who say these things often have never studied the matter and don't know what they're talking about. But that doesn't stop the opinions. Is he a Jeffersonian? Is he a Hamiltonian? Is he a fascist? Is he a communist? Is he an aristocrat? Is he a banker? Is he a Democrat? Is he a Republican? Is he stooging for the Japanese? What is he? And then the next question was, I had heard that there had been a change in his point of view from earlier in his career to later. And by my study, I found out that this change more or less took place from the time he got polio in 1921 and was fighting on the side of the British. How did he get to be like that? He was the naval aide to Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, from the Oyster Bay, Long Island Roosevelt family. They're tied together a long time ago. They're fifth cousins, FDR and Franklin. But Theodore Roosevelt was Franklin's, in many ways, his hero when he was growing up. And he married Theodore Roosevelt's niece, Eleanor Roosevelt. So she was already a Roosevelt when he married her. And Theodore Roosevelt gave Eleanor away in marriage, his niece, to Franklin Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt's policy was that there should be an Anglo-Saxon world empire.
Oh,
He took office by the assassination of McKinley, and he was a racist, and he was a man who shut down the West, reversed many of Lincoln's policies, pretended that he was helping the working man by stopping Rockefeller or something like that. But he actually didn't do that. He didn't stop any of Wall Street and turned over the country to them. But because he was so robust and an activist and got the government to do things, maybe not the right things, but to do things, FDR thought very highly of him, and they were fairly closely connected. So after he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, in 1920, at the end of the Woodrow Wilson administration. Here, you go ahead. That's all right. Sure. Franklin Roosevelt was nominated by the Democratic Party, young man. He was nominated at the age of 38, I think it was, to be the candidate for Vice President of the United States, along with a guy named Cox, who was running for president on the Democratic ticket. Anyway, let me start by saying that we need Roosevelt now. We need what he stood for, how he led the country, how he went to save the United States in a terrible crisis and to save it from the Nazis who were in New York and London and Germany. And the ones in New York and London were the ones who put the Nazis in power in Germany. And this is all in the period when Franklin Roosevelt was president. We need him, and I'm going to discuss how he changed himself in a certain period of his life and put himself into the mental and moral position to provide the leadership necessary to save the country and to prevent the world from going to hell. And obviously the first question somebody would have is, well, why do we need Roosevelt? He's a controversial figure. All of our history is controversial. I think that by showing you how he changed himself in this period, you will have also a good sense of why we need that kind of a person and how we could bring about changes, political changes, philosophical changes quickly in the population to make there be born now Roosevelts. Not just born as babies and grow up, but people who are now kids or young adults or older people to act like Roosevelt. What's needed to produce a new Roosevelt or a whole generation of people that think that way? I don't know if this is going to show up. I think the computer's frozen. What do you think?
Let's see.
There you go. Oh, there you go. Okay. Well, I can't use that mouse. That's the problem. Too much. Okay, here we go. That's not too bad. Can you show this on a whole screen? Let's see. To recover from being crippled from the waist down until 7 years later, 1928, he ran for governor of New York, was elected, served for 4 years in that office, and then was elected president. By the time he ran for governor, he was fully equipped and ready, and had already begun to reorganize the National Democratic Party. So, having some idea of this to start with, I wanted to find out what was the change. So I went up there, and I spent 4 intensive days of study in FDR's own letters, his materials. The staff is very friendly. They're very excited about anybody doing serious research. And this is crucial because, in general, the 20th century and the 21st century does not usually involve very serious investigations of history. Most history is simply received from one person to another. You know, like we were talking about, his father had the idea that no one makes up a new idea. They always get something from the past. Well, that's what history is usually. So we had to do something entirely different here. When he was in politics, he started out in the legislature in New York, born in 1882. He's in the legislature in the early 20th century. And he was appointed by Woodrow Wilson in 1913 to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He had studied the Navy, knew a lot about it. In that earlier part of his life, up until his late 30s, he was somewhat stiff. He was very pleasant and so forth, but he had I have found, quite a different outlook. He always wanted to help the people, and he knew a lot about the background. His family background goes back to Isaac Roosevelt, who was that's his great-great-grandfather, who was the right-hand man to Alexander Hamilton in the Revolution, in the New York State fight for the Constitution, things like that.